Okay. Should be good. Okay, for anyone who found their way to this one, welcome back.
Oh, are we back?
Yeah,
Are we good? Okay.
we are directly back.
Yeah, sorry for the dropout, guys.
Yeah. Yeah,
The
just
interwebs.
lost internet.
Yeah.
Love to see it. Um, yeah, Emmanuel, you were talking about the difference of meaning between the words liberty and freedom
Right.
between different languages.
Yeah. And they're the origins, and um, trying to regain my train of thought.
Mm.
Right. The interesting thing to me, why this is interesting to me, is that there are also cultural differences behind the difference in the meaning. Where you have it's almost a bit of a cliche where the Germanic peoples were very much known to love their freedom and their independence, um, to extreme levels, one could say. Um, Whereas the, their brothers and sisters to the west, um, had a bit of a different approach towards liberty. It was sort of like a bit more pragmatic and, well, we can do deals and this and that, and we can accommodate in this sense. I'm kind of referring a bit to the Romans, um, whereas the Germanic tribes were very much almost like a zero tolerance policy towards anything that wasn't absolute freedom. Um, so just on that note, it's interesting to see that different cultures have different, you know, dating back thousands of years, um, different ideas about how they rank, um, safety and freedom, dating back thousands of years. And it was interesting to me to see the difference also in the last 2 years of how Germanic, or you could say Germanic speaking or Germanic cultures reacted to the safety that was offered them or enforced upon them, um, versus how the people towards the west, the more the I don't want to say they're not Germanic, because they actually, the Franks were, um, actually Germanics. They were Germans, Germanic tribes, but yeah, they had this split off very much early on. Anyway, it's just an interesting thing
Mm.
about the difference in the meaning of the words. But how does one go about in today's world deciding what gravitas they're going to put on freedom, or liberty, um, when it comes to
Mm.
safety and security?
Well, just quickly to go back to when you were talking about how it is different between languages and
Mm-hmm.
also the origins of the words liberty and freedom. Since liberty comes from French, but it doesn't mean the same thing that it does in English, does it? Because it isn't the direct translation for liberty or liberté, isn't that freedom?
No, that's the thing. That's the problem I was having, is when I was trying to write in either French or German,
Mm.
it dawned on me there is no such word. Like, in English, we have both the word liberty and freedom.
Yeah.
In French, there's no word for Freiheit. And in German, there's no word for liberté.
Really?
Yeah,
That's interesting.
doesn't exist. So that's what I was faced with.
I guess it makes sense why in German speaking countries people say liberté, because the freedom or Freiheit does not actually mean what they're trying to say.
I think nowadays, if you went to the average German and you said, "Do you know what the difference is between Liberté and Freiheit?" They would probably be like, "Nah."
Hmm.
And also with the French, I don't think they would know like what the difference is
You don't
there
think that's the intention
of.
of people using the word liberté instead of Freiheit?
No, I think it's just it was never needed. It was
Uh,
never that. It goes also in line with, the French philosophers and how they sort of, during the Age of Enlightenment and so on, the thinking of Rousseau and so on. They came up with Rousseau came up with the notion of the social contract. Um, and this is where this is the idea it kind of goes into, is that it wasn't just a French idea. It was also the English thinkers also came up with this notion, and that is, you can have in a society you can have freedom, but not absolute freedom, right?
Hmm.
As an individual, it has to be in check with the freedom of the next guy over, right?
Yep.
So, um,
Hmm.
whereas the German culture was very much more individualistic and less collectivist
Hmm.
in my view.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So the question is, where do you draw the line between freedom and safety? And would you
Mm-hmm.
then call that line like the perfect liberty?
Yeah, you could phrase it like that. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Mm.
Mhm. Yeah, I would say that probably more accurately fits the definition of the word liberty rather than freedom.
Hmm.
The way I understand the distinction between the words in English, I'm sure everyone has an understanding of the distinction, but I'd assume it's so you kind of use it interchangeably in English as well. Like if you say I have the freedom to do such and such,
Mm-hmm.
what you're saying really is that I can do this within the realm of what is permitted to me.
Mm-hmm.
So liberty, in a sense, means something you are allowed to do, or let's say not disallowed to do, whereas freedom goes beyond what's allowed. As I'd let's say for me, that would be the distinction between the words.
Mm.
Freedom is absolute from my individual perspective, and liberty means, that's a common saying in English, right? I am at liberty to do such and such. It means that
Correct.
I
Hmm.
am somehow permitted to do this within the boundaries of the laws or my physical abilities or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Mm.
So then I'd say, as far as the I'd call it a dilemma, probably the whole freedom versus safety dilemma, as we found it's quite a dilemma. It will probably be as distinct as many people there are who have their opinion on it, right? Because we can have, let's say, maybe our classical libertarian ideal. I was thinking a little bit about it today, almost like um, let's say the basic concept of my um, freedom ends, or my liberty ends where yours begins, and my rights end where yours begin. And I was trying to conceptualize, well, in light of, let's say, the way it's been distorted and used the last couple of years, how it could be seen. The more, for me, the more traditional way I've seen it is almost like you have to imagine a little bubble around each person,
Mm-hmm.
and that's like your personal freedom bubble. At the moment that bubble touches the other person's bubble,
Mm-hmm.
you've gone too far, right?
Mm.
But the other way around as well. So that bubble means a place where you stop, but also a place where they stop. It means theoretically what happens inside that bubble is no one else's business.
Mm-hmm.
That's how I understand. Or let's say I'd be coming from that point, if we're to further discuss it, just so people can kind of understand. Because otherwise, you say, well, yeah, well, I carry viruses, I spread them, or I breathe, and that might, cause something terrible to happen. But working within understanding that I have this bubble around me, within that bubble, it's my freedom.
Mm-hmm.
That's where no one really should dictate what's happening to that. So whatever you
Mm-hmm.
define the bubble as, you might define it
Right.
as your house, you might define it as your country, you might define it as your skin, uh, whatever. But at some point, there's that bubble, because otherwise, yes, there's no real stopping point. If
Mm-hmm.
you say,
Yeah.
uh, there was an article recently where a guy was saying, well, like, for some people, a sore throat is a terrible thing. So it's like, what am I going to now, you know, give up my rights to independent and free movement because someone might get a sore throat if he interacts with me?
Mm-hmm.
That's
Mm-hmm.
Mm.
why I think it.
I think the analogy of a bubble is a very good one. And later on, I would like to read something from On Liberty by John Stuart Mill, in which interestingly enough, we are not the first people to think of this. Um, and really, the question is, where's the bubble, or how extended is the bubble? Where does the bubble start? Where does the bubble end? And so on.
Mm.
Um, but first, I have here actually with me the Social Contract by Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And
Mhm.
there's a couple sentences just in the first few pages. Actually, the chapter 1, um, which is called Subject of the First Book, and he says here he writes, "Man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains." I thought that's a really interesting
Mm.
an interesting eh, this is how he starts the book. That's his first sentence.
Mhm.
Um, Many a one believes himself the master of others, and yet he is a greater slave than they. How has this change come about? I do not know. What can render it legitimate? I believe that I can settle this question. He says, if I consider only force and the results that proceed from it, I should say that so long as a people is compelled to obey and does obey, it does well. But that, so soon as it can shake off the yoke, and does shake it off, it does better. For if men recover their freedom by virtue of the same right by which it was taken away, either they are justified in resuming it, or there was no justification for depriving them of it. I found
Hmm.
that to be really interesting. How so basically, yeah, if people can recover their freedom by the same using the same methodology, the same method by which their liberty or freedom was taken away, then it is just.
Mm.
Otherwise, you have to say that, like he says, either it was unjust to take it away in the first place. Um, yeah, either they are justified in resuming it, or there was no justification for depriving them of it in the first place.
Yeah. So if they were physically restrained from their freedom and they were able to physically regain it,
Or manipulated
or they were
in any
manipulated,
way.
yeah, um, then that's justified if they can also essentially manipulate their way back to freedom.
Right.
Does that only work in sort of the context of an entire people, a nation, or a society, or does that also work down to the individual?
I mean, I would say it's definitely applicable at an individual level as well.
Mm-hmm.
But Rousseau's whole sort of, at least this book that he wrote, was really dealing with people as a collective, as a group, as a society.
Mm.
That was the point of inspecting what this so-called social contract was. In chapter 2, he says something very interesting as well. He says, the earliest of all societies and the only natural one is the family. Yet children remain attached to their father only so long as they have need of him for their own preservation. As soon as this need ceases, the natural bond is dissolved. The children, being freed from the obedience which they owed to their father, and the father from the cares which he owed to his children, become equally independent. If they remain united, it is no longer naturally, but voluntarily, and the family itself is kept together only by convention. And I thought that is a really interesting idea where the children remain attached to their father only so long as they have need of him for their own preservation. And that was something that, like, over time, whenever I thought about how do I balance um, freedom with safety, the first question I asked myself was, what am I trying to be safe from?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
because you know that, I mean, that's at the end of the day, that's the question.
Hmm.
I am born free, so that's the default position that I'm existing in,
That dictates where the line is.
right?
Yeah.
So the question is, what am I trying to be safe from? And then
Mm.
from that point, I start to think about, okay, if I want to be safe from a bear, can I defend myself against a bear,
Mm.
right? And if I can't, well, then I need some other way to ensure my safety against a bear.
Yeah.
There's a very simple way of thinking about it, but
It's also down to the individual because different people feel like they need to be secure from different things. Like
absolutely.
some people think, yeah, I don't care about bears. I'll just clap and they go away. And obviously some people think I would rather not have to do that. Jason in the chat asked, are they kept together by convention or by choice and or need? Referring to the father and the
Family.
son. Yeah.
Well, choice is what he said voluntarily.
Yeah.
So he choice he mentions, and need. I mean, it could be that they need one another, but it would be more for practical reasons,
Yeah.
resources or something like that.
Because I believe how that scenario was kind of formed in the book was the children need their father until they become of age and then they don't anymore, right? And then they only stay together by choice,
Right,
not by need.
right,
Yeah.
voluntarily. And what he means by, well, what I think he means when he says the family itself is kept together only by convention, is that later on, sort of like kept together, meaning that they still come together for birthdays and they still come together for, celebrations and this and that, the other. That all has to do more with convention rather than the the need of the child to depend on the parents, and the parents feeling they owe the children protection and so on. It's, and resources. It's more, it's a different kind of relationship from that point on, and it has to do with tradition, and that's, in this case he uses the word convention.
Mm.
But yeah.
So if you're trying to find where that line is, then you have to define the things that you want to be safe from. But since that's a very individual thing, how do you actually go about making a line for an entire society? Or do you have to have different lines within that society depending on the communities within it? What do you think, Mark?
Um, I would probably have leaned towards a yes on that, depending from
Mm.
what perspective you look. If you're looking from, I think, I think a lot of people feel a lot more helpless than they actually are. I think that's
Hmm.
a pretty safe starting point. Um, I'm not
Mm.
going to say more now than in the past because I didn't live in the past, but um, but I'd say it does strike me that like it's almost somewhat encouraged, if not at least not discouraged, to feel pretty helpless and thus be really dependent and reliant on so many different people to provide so many of your not just safety issues but any of your needs, and I
Hmm.
guess those tie
Mm-hmm.
in quite closely with your safety issues. But I would say, yeah, I mean, I guess at the root of things, that's the principle of insurance is kind of like whatever you feel you need protection
Hmm.
against, you get insurance, right? I guess that then obviously led to a lot of funny things such as the mafia, where they then pretty much create a scenario from which you need safety so they can insure you, right? As far as I'm aware, I think that the mafia were the ones who first set up the fire departments,
Oh, really?
uh, because they'd pretty much, yeah, say, look, we'll burn your place if you don't pay, and and then we'll sell you the insurance for the fire department. Um, at least I heard or read something like that. I guess in the States, yeah,
Mm.
because obviously we've had some kind of fire service in Europe since at least Roman times. Um, Yeah, so I guess that's the catch. But I'd say, yeah, when it comes to that, at least you'd say that's probably the most true to each individual's freedom. It's kind of like, well, do you feel you need protection, or someone to, to pay your health bills in case you might one day get sick? Oh, that's a question of health insurance, or
Mhm.
fire hazard insurance if you own your house and you don't want to lose it all. Um, I don't know if you'd have to have a standard across the board in a society without it. I mean, I don't think it would be that complicated to not. But I understand how, in our, let's say, as our societies became more unequal, there was more of a need or a desire, or an empathy to sort of, yeah, to sort of, I guess, standardize things so that it would cover those who maybe couldn't afford providing for their safety and issues that they felt they needed safety for.
Hmm.
Yeah.
That's
Jason asked, has the pandemic made people feel they're helpless and need governments to protect them? It's kind of the mafia deal again. Which is interesting if you're talking about the government in that context.
I think it's obvious that the government has an invested interest in victims. I think that that's especially this is something uh, I maybe it's not too pertinent in this case, but I'm gonna fall into it, and that is to me, and this is just my view again. To me, the further left you go in the political spectrum, the the more you see politics that is how do you say, it is marketed to victimhood. The further left you go, you get um, you are downtrodden, you are oppressed, you need our help, and here we are. And I'm not saying that there is no need for to help people um, who have fallen on hard times in society.
Mm.
You know, I've fallen on hard times, and I've been very glad for the help that I've received from the taxpayers. However, um, I did my damnedest to get off the public purse,
Yeah.
and and I did my damnedest without prodding and without being told you have to do this. It was just in me. I did not like the idea of leeching on other people's hard work. That's how I felt. Um, but of course, I understand that there are, although I do think it's a very small number of people in our society, very small. There are people who really, for whatever reason, they just cannot, whether it's due to physical problems or psychological problems, they cannot um, get off the common purse, the
Mm.
public purse. But that is my thing with the left. It has become, or maybe it always has been. I don't know. No, it probably all doesn't. It probably hasn't always been how extreme it has been in the last couple decades. But to me, the left has become basically preaching the message, preaching the gospel of victimhood and oppression to the public. And it seems to me like it's in their best interest to basically tell the people that they are oppressed and that they are victims and that they need the government's help in a way to kind of substantiate their own motivation for being in politics in the first place, which I think for a lot of people is a lot of people in the government. I think the motivation for being in government is not because they actually love and care for the nation, but because they are looking out for their own interests. And in saying that, I want to segue into something here
Uh,
again.
sorry.
Oh, sorry.
Regarding what you said about the farther left you
Yeah.
go, the more that it caters to victims,
Mhm.
or the more that they target victims.
Yeah.
Um, doesn't that also speak true to the farther right you go? It's in a
um,
different way, but I would also argue that on the right side, like if you go farther right, they would argue that like people on that side are being victimized by other people's freedoms.
what I would say is the difference is that while you might be right there in the case of, for example, the right might tell tell the people in the country you are a victim of mass immigration, for
Right.
example, right? Um, the difference for me there is that uh, the left will be telling its victims, let's say, uh, you are a victim, and the end. It the uh, if you look at the narrative from the left, I've yet to see the left calling people to greatness, calling people out of their.
I do agree with that. Like, I think you have to go less far left to find that. I
Yeah,
think you have
like
to go
centrist.
reasonably
Yeah.
far right to find like really intense preying on victims, or at least telling people that they're victims of something. Um, but on the left, that does, yeah, I agree, that does seem to make up more of what that ideology is.
Yeah, I mean, if you just think about the actual political parties and what they stand for, I mean, you look at a party like the FDP or the SVP, which are right of center. Um, you see what their party programs are, and it's full of stuff like, um, strong economy and strong immigration policy and stuff that is calling people to sort of like stand on their own 2 feet, be sovereign, this and that and the other. Whereas on the left, it's really all about social welfare. And it's not that the left should not be pushing for people who have less opportunities to have their lives improved, to get that little boost up so that they.
Yeah,
But this is the part that's missing to me. You get the little boost up. For what purpose?
I feel. Mhm.
Like that's the part that's missing to me is, okay, we're going to give you this boost, but then we're going to expect you to achieve. We're going to expect you to, get off of the welfare system or whatever. The left seems
Mhm.
very content with more and more people being on welfare. That's the thing.
Right. I think actually, it's almost like an illusion. Um, a lot of that, calling someone, look, you're a victim and you need to be liberated.
Mm-hmm.
The method of liberation is not actually to empower someone to rise out of it. It's to push people around you down so that
Yeah.
you're on the same level.
Yeah.
It's not actually like saying, look, be empowered in yourself and bring yourself out of this hole, or at least here are the tools to do it.
Yeah.
It's okay, so everyone else has to come down now to your level so that now you're all on the same playing field. But then everyone has a yoke to bear. That's just everyone that then has a weight on them, instead of actually taking the weight off of that person so that they can come up.
Right. And the left seem very good at sort of like telling you as a victim, it's not your fault. It's not your fault.
It's never your fault.
It's the patriarchy.
God forbid.
It's it's racism, it's xenophobia, it's something external to yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And if you just join us, we together can help destroy all these problems that are creating such a shit life for you.
Yep.
But you yourself, you are perfect just the way you are.
Yep.
And to me, I feel that to the left, people like that are, for them, perfect just the way they are, because they're the ones who are the easiest to be manipulated. Whereas if you are preaching the gospel of sovereignty, if you are preaching the gospel of self-accountability, this is another thing: self-accountability, self-responsibility. Good luck. Good luck. Having power over those people.
Yep.
Could I just say something to that? I would say, probably just to take it away, let's say from a left-right or political standpoint, I think it's just clear. One can say, especially in representative governments or representative democracies, you have to always look at the perspective from the person in power, or let's say whoever the person in politics is. So whether it's right or left, if their interest is, let's put it this way: if people felt they could represent themselves, they were strong enough to represent themselves, they don't need a representative.
Mm-hmm.
let's say historically it was probably, well, I'm sure even had to do with simple things just as linguistic skills. If you weren't able to express yourself in a way that would get the people in power to listen, well, you pretty much got someone who could to represent you. Now, obviously, we all are pretty fluent linguistically, so it's less about that. So I guess whether I'd say disregarding what side of the spectrum any political leader in this sense would be, their interest is to keep their position, and to keep their position, they have to make you feel that you have a need for them. So that's just going to be pretty much, say, politician 101 is like you have to make the people feel they need you, and people who feel very strong on their own are not going to really feel like they need you. So so that's just, I mean, I'd say yeah, I mean, it's pretty standard, that would be expected, just standard way of doing it. I was going to first say, the more fascist you go in whichever direction, but then I was reminded of some of Hitler's writings I had studied in the past, and it definitely didn't agree with that statement. So I would just say in general. So it's more about, if the representative wants to retain power, they're going to want to make you feel like you need them.
Right.
And obviously, some just, I don't know. You could say maybe some are better at it. Yeah. So it could be that you find it more represented in certain spectrums politically, but I'd say just in general, that would, I'd imagine if I was a politician, that would be my strategy. You have to kind of give the people a reason for why they need you,
Right.
to talk for them, right?
Not to become obsolete.
Exactly.
To the mass. Well, this section is a bit poignant here, where Rousseau, he says, the family is then, if you will, the primitive model of political societies. The chief is the analog of the father, while the people represent the children. And all, being born free and equal, alienate their liberty only for their own advantage. The whole difference, and this is interesting, the whole difference is that, in the family, the father's love for his children repays him for the care that he bestows. In the state, the pleasure of ruling makes up for the chief's lack of love for his people. I absolutely loved that, because
that's good.
Like, hand on heart, right now, I cannot say that I think most people in government love, or that most people in government are in government because of a love for the people. I absolutely I couldn't state that. I think most people in government are there for other reasons, whether it's for power itself, the feeling of power, or the things that power can afford them, like resources, money, other things. But I think the number of people who are in government because they truly have this love for the people, I think they are very few and far between. And the other thing that he says here, which also stuck out to me, when he says, the children. Well, he says the chief is the analog of the father, and the people represent the children, and all being born free and equal alienate their liberty only for their own advantage. And this sounds, at first, it sounds really, you're so selfish, right? But then I've thought about this stuff before, but I didn't make the connection here. And then I read this and I thought, no, actually, the reason why I agree to not go and rob you, to not take your shit, is because I don't want you to take my shit.
Right.
So that is to my advantage.
However, that falls apart if one of us starts stealing the other guy's shit.
Exactly.
As soon as one person starts, everyone starts, and then everyone's stealing, and then,
But
that's your experience when you leave Switzerland. It's like, oh, okay, it's different here.
Yeah. but the fact that we agree to these things are really to our own advantage, and that's not a bad thing either. I mean, if we functioned, I thought about this the other day too, like, if we went through life not doing the things that benefit ourselves, we'd probably all be dead in like 24 hours.
Yeah, I mean, probably. There's a lot of danger out there.
Mhm.
I mean, it's pretty beneficial to do things that are in your benefit.
Yeah, of course.
Kind of helps living. The thing that you, Mark, brought up about this bubble thing, the bubble around each of us, and sort of like if we do something that creates contact with someone else's bubble, I think
Mhm.
this is something that's gonna be uh, a big question in the COVID discussion.
Mhm.
John Stuart Mill, he says the acts of an individual may be hurtful to others or wanting in due consideration for their welfare without going to the length of violating any of their constituted rights. The offender may then be justly punished by opinion, though not by law. And
Hmm.
that's an interesting distinction. So he first makes the distinction that the acts of an individual may be hurtful to others or wanting in due consideration for their welfare without violating any of their constituted rights.
Yeah, definitely. That's kind of where that line is. I mean, since the line has to legally be drawn to
Mhm.
at what point does safety have to translate into freedom? For example, like I can insult you and it's not illegal, right? Even though it might hurt your feelings and you would love for it to be illegal.
Assault me?
No, insult.
Oh. What world can you assault
I don't
me
know.
about?
In Germany, actually.
Really?
Yeah, I think if you're defending someone's honor, you can.
Aha.
You can.
Okay.
I don't know. I heard that. You could verify that. No, but like if I insult you, of course that's not illegal, but you would want it to be. Maybe.
Maybe.
Yeah. So that's where that line doesn't actually meet what the individual would define as where their safety, where their bubble is. But everyone has sort of their standard legal bubble, and some people would like it to be bigger, and some people would
Yeah.
like everyone's to be smaller, so that everyone can operate a little bit more freely.
That's the thing, though. It seems to me like over the past couple decades, Western society has been moving very quickly in the direction of trying to inflate this bubble as big as possible.
Mm.
You know, to the point where we have all this stuff regarding pronouns and all this kind
Yeah.
of stuff where it's
Yeah.
like, it's my right not to be offended. And it's like, well, is it though? Because as soon as that's made a right, then, you know, something like what John Stuart Mill said here is like, you know, okay, well, now it's your right to not be offended. So I guess the law needs to crack down on people who are offending, right?
I love the analogy with the bubble because you can it actually works so well. The idea of let's increase people's bubbles so that they feel safer, like nothing can touch them, nothing anyone does that hurts them can be allowed. Not everyone can have a bubble that encompasses like everything around them. There's not enough space for that. At some point people's bubbles are going to overlap, and the more freedoms you give well, not freedoms, the bigger the bubble you give everyone, the more overlap
rights.
each bubble gets.
Yeah.
There's not actually a fixed line that you can put there. If everyone's bubbles are huge, you're taking away each person's freedom a little bit more.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The free space outside the bubbles. Right?
Everyone
That's like
has tons of space, and there's not enough space for everyone.
Right. Huh. Then we all just have to jump into the same bubble.
It's like the bubble's actually getting smaller, but you're just moving them to a corner and facing them the way they came, so it looks like it's getting bigger. But behind them, they're like getting no room anymore.
I guess theoretically, the moment you inflate your bubble, you intentionally or unintentionally are also inflating other people's bubbles because the bubble is based on their personal rights.
Yeah.
So if you think you can extend yours, well, you're going to have to be extending theirs too, and that might work. Just continue to work against what you're actually trying to achieve by growing your bubble, which is kind of what went on, right? Where it's kind of like, oh no, see, that's the moment your bubble bumped with mine, that means back off. You're not allowed to touch any of this, and this bit here is me deciding what I want to do.
Mm-hmm.
But yes, it's definitely that's one I think we're going to see being challenged very strongly, as it has been in the recent past, and it will probably yes,
Hmm.
get challenged strongly
How do
in the
we
years to come.
how do we as individuals though? How do we, just thinking to ourselves, how do we go about deciding what we want in our bubbles? This is going to be a great analogy
Yeah.
forever.
Mm.
And what we say, no, that doesn't need to be in our bubbles. In other words, so what we're saying now, I think, is whatever's in the bubble is what we determine to be our rights, right? Our natural, or our constituted rights, right?
Unalienable.
Uh, yeah, unalienable. It should be unalienable, but we'll
Yeah.
get to that later.
Well, I mean, I think that's the only way, yeah, that you can actually find a
It's true.
common bubble.
Yeah.
Not,
So
yeah.
how do we decide what is in that bubble, and how do we decide what, nah, that doesn't need to be in our bubble?
Mm-hmm.
And it has to be kind of a standardized bubble, right? Because you don't get to decide what's in your bubble. Like, not everyone can decide what's in their own bubble. Because there
No,
is
I'd say
gonna be too much overlap.
a
Or can you?
standardized minimum bubble.
A
So I think
standardized, yeah.
the standardized minimum, and you grow your bubble as much as you want to, as long as you're not bumping into someone else's minimal bubble.
Yeah.
okay, but we can't say that, because if we're talking about constituted rights, which are, like, what I mean by constituted rights are rights that are written down in the country as sort of like, these are the rights of the people, whether it's in a constitution or in some other legal document. Then we cannot have some people running around with, let's say, 100, bubble size 120, and some people running around with a bubble size 40. You know what I mean?
I think you probably wouldn't even notice it, as long as your bubble's not being infringed upon.
Hmm.
Understand? Like, to me, what does it matter if, let's put it this, let's make an analogy of wealthy people. So what difference does it make to me if someone's getting paid $1 million a month for playing football, as long as I am living the standard I want with my 10,000, just as a comparison.
Yeah,
So
but
it
if we're
doesn't
talking,
matter to me bubble. The thing with constituted rights means that's legal, right? And then we come again to, well, the whole question of laws and who writes them, and if there's anything moral about being ruled over by laws that you didn't have any say in creating, et cetera, et cetera. Plus, they're very flexible, right? Because they can change. The government can change them to fit whatever they decide your bubble should look like, and that bubble might, or their idea might be, let's get rid of bubbles, and you're
Welcome to
pretty
China.
much property of the state.
Yeah.
Let's say if you look at legislation heading towards that way with like your organs and that kind of stuff. That's
right. Okay.
kind of deep into your bubble.
Right. Okay. So can we say, like, what's, I mean, the way that I would approach it is, what are the, I would be very minimalistic in the way that I would try to figure out what were the constituted rights that I would want. I would be very minimalistic about that. I would start from the question of, okay, what are the most basic things that I require in order to live and to, have how do you say, control over my own fate, right? So something to that extent. And so you'll have people that, for example, say, well, what is the American term? Right to the pursuit of happiness, or something like that.
Mm.
And then you'll
Life,
have
liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And then you have other people who say, no, that's not enough. I need also the right to be prosperous, or something like this.
Mm.
And this is the thing for me, is like, all these rights, for example, right to an education, right to, in the last couple of years, for example, right to health, right? I mean, so how do I tell someone else uh, I want to have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, but the right to education, that's going too far, or the right to health, that's going too far, or the right to whatever is going too far.
You'd have to do that democratically, I think. No,
Well, that's
Yeah.
why before
each
mentioned
person, yeah,
inalienable rights, right? Because
yeah.
that's why I tried to stress the word inalienable. And that's obviously, I'd say, even if the three of us tried to define what for us would be considered an inalienable rights, we'd probably have very different opinions. Um, but I think it's important to think that way. Like,
Well,
I guess
inalienable
that's
just
what they
means it
tried to
cannot
do
be
with like
taken away from you,
fundamental
right?
human rights. Let's say, yeah,
Yeah.
inalienable means something that you as a human, just by being a human,
Yep.
um, have.
Right.
So it's bordering on what nature gives you if no one would get in the way.
Mm.
Yep. Okay.
Um,
Life,
let's say
liberty.
they tried to let's say the charters kind of tried to be built on that, these like fundamental human rights or whatever.
Mm.
Some of them are already a little stretched, but let's say in general they tried to boil it down, and I guess it probably is based on the idea of like born as a human. If you have nothing else when you're born, you have what? Your body, your
Mm-hmm.
mental faculties,
Mm-hmm.
and your spirit, whatever, right? So you could say that's, if you boil it down, like it's very
Mm-hmm.
hard for anyone to say why they should have any superiority to your dominion over those three faculties.
Mm-hmm.
At least that's for me. I've been trying to boil it down.
So would you say
That
right to
means
education
like
is a
like no one has a right to stick you into prison because they're taking away your freedom, and your freedom was something you naturally were given just by being born.
mm-hmm.
No, and you're not born a slave.
Mm.
Would you say that right to education is a it's definitely, to me, it's not an inalienable right.
No, I
Because
wouldn't call it. I wouldn't call it an inalienable right, because education is already a concept. I mean, at the
yeah,
end of the day, education is pretty much everything you learn as a
relative
human
to.
from the time you're born till you die.
Mm-hmm.
And there's no person, no matter in what place on earth, that would get through life without ever learning anything, which means
Mm-hmm.
everyone's being educated.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe not to the standard we want or in the things or disciplines we want.
Whether they want it or not.
Yeah, but everyone's being educated. So you could say it's an
Experience.
inalienable right, but the way it's applied is generally
Mm-hmm.
to our standards, to get taught the things we want you to know, et cetera, et cetera. So you need to learn our constructs and frameworks so that you can fulfill what we ideally want to get out of you in society.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I think it's important for people to think, really try thinking inalienable rights. Like, what do they really consider? Just try boiling away all the froth and kind of
Mm-hmm.
see
Mm-hmm.
like, okay, what do I think is something that I can just say, like, there's no, I guess that's what all the philosophers tried to do, of like, who am I
Yeah.
as a person? And that will generally boil down to that. So if they boil down to their spirit, but then you say, okay, well, your spirit is now transported in a vehicle called your body. So theoretically, that's strictly interlaced. And
Mm-hmm.
you could say that your body and your spirit together are what make you you. So that means that's your dominion and your
Mm.
dominion alone. At least as Rousseau said, once you reach independency.
Mm-hmm.
In my opinion, possibly even before that. I think there are limits on parental or societal invasion into a child's uh, dominion, so to
Yeah.
speak.
Yeah, and I also would be very careful using an analogy of parent and child as regards like in relation to government and citizen, or government and non-government citizen,
Mm.
because what I've seen from government is that they are nothing special. For the most part, these people who are in government, they're not necessarily more logical or less biased, um, or more consistent than the average. In other words, they are not more trustworthy, at least in my view, than sort of like the average person on the street.
Mm.
I was just watching the Arena show yesterday regarding um, the funding of the Swiss military, and one of the big questions is regarding the upgrading of the Swiss Air Force.
Mm-hmm.
We have these 30-something-year-old jets.
They're not 30-something years old.
Are they not?
No, they're from the late 70s.
Okay.
Calculate.
What, 40?
Oh, so they're what is that, like 40 years old?
That's more than 40 years old, yeah.
Oh shit! So they're even older than I thought. F-18s, right?
Oh no. Those are the newer batch. The
Oh,
F5s.
okay.
The F5s, we still have some of them. But so
Okay.
do quite a few other countries.
Right.
No, the
okay.
F-18s are not that old.
Yeah.
That's still standard hardware nowadays for most advanced militaries.
Yeah. So the discussion was sort of around this, and for those who are not in Switzerland, the Arena broadcast is broadcasted. It's a TV show that is sort of like a political debate, podium. People from various political parties are up there to be pro and contra the topic, and yeah. And what I saw was they had someone from the FDP, they had someone from Die Mitte, so centrist party and right libertarian party, sort of the pro side of getting the Air Force upgraded with the F-35s. And then the contra side was a representative from the SP, Socialist Party, and a representative from the Greens. And I was watching as the SP representative and the Green Party representative spent so much cognitive energy on being critical, on being analytical, on being doubtful and skeptical of the solution that the federal government was proposing. The federal government was proposing that we upgrade to the F-35s. And I sat there thinking, huh. So in this case, these people, the people from the SP and the Greens, they suddenly have the ability. They suddenly found that enthusiasm to be questioning and critical, and we want full transparency, and we want to know for absolutely sure that this is the right thing to do before we do it. And I was thinking, I kind of wish that same bravado existed over the last 2 years while the federal council, the federal government, the same federal council, same federal government was given essentially a carte blanche by the same political entities. So when I see stuff like that, that's where I'm coming from when I say these people in government are probably less trustworthy, less consistent, more biased than the average person you could just walk up to on the street and say, hey, here's an assortment of options regarding our fighter jets. What do you reckon? You know? So.
Definitely agree. That is definitely not a good option at all. I mean, I sure hope more of the government would question that. Well, that's definitely the worst idea and concept, and the way it was sold to us was completely wrong. But anyways,
I don't know. I don't know the
military technical.
Yeah. I don't know the ins and outs of it. I just know that I saw this incredible skepticism, this healthy skepticism. On the other hand, what you could also see is that they were spreading FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt. And that's all that they were doing. They didn't have any, oh, here's a technical problem with it, or we don't like that about the deal, or anything. It was just, oh, we just don't know. And the whole time, the other two were sort of like trying to like, well, this is why this, and this is why that, trying to explain it to them. And then towards the end, the lady from Die Mitte, from the centrist party, she just she realized, okay, this is what's going on, and she just put it to the lady from the SP. She said, okay, it's obvious you don't like the deal with the F-35s. Okay. The other two options on the table were Germany and France. Which one would you take? and why? And she handed it back over to the SP representative. And the representative goes on to this whole thing that she's been doing the whole program long, saying, we have absolutely no problem with doing the upgrade. We are totally behind having an Air Force, da 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 da. And then not answering the question. And the lady from DeMita says, yeah, okay, Germany or France? Which one? And she says, I can't really actually say which one I'd go for, but just not this one. And it was just like, okay. So
Just wait here then.
yeah, we'll just wait. But anyway, the point was, I don't see the government as being comprised of people who I can trust more than the average person on the street.
Definitely not in
Well,
most governments.
Yeah, the thing is, there's no way for them to really know even surfacely all the topics on which they speak. So a lot of times, yeah, you have a person there talking about fighter jets. They don't have a clue. They probably don't even know the names of the different planes they're talking about, or any specs, or just nothing. Yet they're
But
there
they have
trying
to
to
show
defend it.
certainty.
So well, I mean, I guess in the SP's case, they have to, also pacify the GSOE part of their, or
Mm-hmm.
GSOA, sorry, part of their followers, and
Yep.
now they're obviously walking a tightrope, because ever since this, military operation in the Ukraine, obviously people here are suddenly like, oh my God, do we need an army? So,
Mm-hmm.
they have to change their tone slightly. But I definitely would agree with whoever says anything, because I've always spoken out against the F-35 being an absolute ridiculous thing. And then the way we voted on it, and then the way they interpreted that and or want to execute it, that was, I mean, I'd hope a lot more political voice would be raised over it, because that's a bit of a scandal in itself. But yeah, I mean, lobbying, at the end of the day, I understand why they did it, but that doesn't mean it's a good thing.
Before we go to break, we've got a couple comments. Jason said there was a good example of bubbles mixing recently with the transgender swimmer beating all the female athletes in swimming championships in the US. So that is a great example of a swimmer essentially saying, okay, here's a bigger bubble, and that basically encroached on all of the other bubbles of the other swimmers. The spoiler is eventually that bubble was shrunk again. The title was taken away from that swimmer by the
Leah Thomas.
Yeah.
It was taken away.
Yeah.
For reals?
The governor took it away.
Holy crap!
Yeah.
On what basis?
On the basis of that was unfair, like that wasn't legitimate. Yeah, it wasn't. Even Caitlyn Jenner has been very vocal about this, saying like this is some bullshit. And Loris said, in regards to rights, I think in a capitalistic system, everyone should have the right to equal opportunity, like an equal starting position, and that's where the problems begin.
Ooh, that's okay. Equal opportunity, yes. No,
not equal
opportunity before the law, yes.
Yeah. So essentially, equal starting positions. The most obvious difference in a starting position is your financial bracket, right?
Mm-hmm.
How do you do that? Well, I guess you have to say parents can't leave anything to their kids or something like this. Or kids all get... Yeah, so you could work off of bring everyone down to the same level, meaning parents can't leave anything to their kids, or all kids get a certain amount of money.
Mm-hmm.
Like maybe when they... Yeah,
I'd have to say that's actually one of the more socialistic ideas that let's say, that I've come to consider,
like standard
actually
universal
came to it
income,
myself,
right?
when having discussions on that, because I'd say yes, if you want to talk about equality, you only really could have equality if everyone has, at some point in time, would have to have the same starting point.
Right.
Even if you want to keep things like inheritance, you'd have to say, well, then, at some point, the top of some tree of ancestry will have to have completely equal starting point than everyone else, because obviously where they start discussing these kind of things, it's kind of like, oh, it's all equal. Yeah, yeah, you're all equal, you're all free to whatever. But certain people or families have all the wealth and power in their hands, so it's not like you really have a
Yeah.
chance to become all you could be. I'd say for me that was logical. Like if you'd really want to say, well, then everyone starts equal, and then if some people mess it up or some people don't, I guess maybe in the Soviet Union right around the time of the fall, okay, you already kind of had obviously some people who were very wealthy, but let's say the majority of the people then more or less had the same starting point.
Yeah.
Most of them had their place, their home, because people would get a home that part of the world, and obviously jobs, all that kind of ended, but the companies were sort of equally divided into shares, and those shares given to the workers of the plants. Then a lot of people decided, oh, that was so worthless at that time. Obviously, then the West came in with all their FDI, and then people were going and selling it for peanuts just to get some money to live because they lost their jobs. They had nothing just to feed themselves with. And I guess others maybe thought, I'll starve and I'll buy my neighbor's shares, and then eventually made it further. So you could say maybe
Mhm.
among that group of people, then they had equal opportunities, in comparison to others that were at the same starting point. But otherwise, let's say in our part of the world, you have to go back, probably at least to Roman times to trace back where the money started being accumulated in certain people's hands.
Mm-hmm.
Mm.
So yeah. So as far as that goes about the equal opportunity, I'd say that's the only way the only part of the argument that I'd say maybe would have some. I could understand some foundation to that line of
Yeah,
thinking.
I agree.
Yeah, I could have some understanding for it, but I see more problems than solutions going down that road
Yeah.
myself. So I mean, you just start to actually think about how it would be implemented. Um, not just a question of where do you get the resources for implementing it, but where do you draw the lines, that sort of thing. Um, one could also say that we are all starting uh well, a lot of us are starting at an equal point right now, or as equal as it can get, and some of us are fucking it up and messing it up. So that dichotomy is already occurring right now. There's people who are born pretty much in the same kind of middle class family or whatever, and they have the same kind of resources, the same kind of opportunities for sure, and yet some of them go on to become, you know, whatever. It's also a matter, I think, of how society views um, progress and performance and all this kind of stuff.
Hmm.
So I don't think I think we've become, as societies, we've become in the West extremely materialistic, and we've become so obsessively focused on sort of like the measurement of success being, what car you're driving and all this kind of stuff. And I think that gradually that's going to kind of start crumbling. I think it already is kind of starting to crumble.
Because we're gonna all
Um,
be poor.
well, either because of that or because we're just realizing that it ain't actually giving us a good life, and that's
No.
one of the big topics we have on the
Yeah.
list is what is a good life.
Yeah.
But
We could tie that into this one.
we could,
But shall we go for break 5 minutes and then
and
come
then we're
back?
coming back.
We'll be back.
Yeah.
We'll be back.
We'll be
I was
back.
gonna say, just with that, the thing about, let's say, starting at an equal point, and what it boils down to really is actually property rights. So you could pretty much say, as long as property rights exist, um, yeah, I don't see it as ever really being a realistic possibility.
Hmm.
We will have to do
Mm.
another segment on the
Anyways,
question of equality and
Yeah.
all that stuff.
Yeah,
Cool.
we're gonna need a few
We'll be back in
segments.
5.
All right. See you
Cheers.
in a bit, everyone. Hey. All right, we're back.
Hey. That's how we intro. Hey.
All right. Switching gears somewhat
Switching to a low
to
gear.
the funnest topic of them all, the fairest in the land.
So yeah, we've been wanting to do a COVID segment for a while, but well, we meaning me.
I've wanted to do it as well. It's just like
It's full on.
it's a thing.
Yeah. No, but what was timely about doing it sort of now was yesterday, don't you know, was our Freedom Day. And we
Well,
are
you call it. You literally said yesterday, like, today's Freedom Day, and I was like, what? I look at the calendar. I was like, what the heck is he talking about? And he's like, today was like no Moss time. I was like, aha, okay. So Freedom Day is what he calls it. It's not a bad name.
It's not just what I called it.
Who calls it that? Do you
It
call it that?
was some in the media were calling it that. It was on Twitter, in the Twitter sphere. It was
Let's
hashtagging.
do
It
what
was
Twitter
trending
does.
on Twitter. Freedom
I
Day.
call it Regain Your Rights Day.
Yeah, regain your rights or back to normalcy.
Back to normalcy, I think, because the majority of the rights we regained back when they actually lifted most of the Maßnahmen, like when you could actually go into stores again or into like gastronomy without a certificate.
And
Yeah, getting rid of the certificate, that was the big. This one was just kind of like,
Well, the right to breathe in public transport.
yeah,
In any case.
yeah.
unhindered. The right to breathe unhindered. That's a right. There you go.
Depends
An
whose bubble you're asking.
Hey, that's an inalienable right.
That's what I was going to say. That's an
Apparently
inalienable
not.
right.
Not not
Because
if someone
when you're
else's
born-
bubble is saying no, you can't.
You're not born with a mask.
You're not born with a mask.
Aha, but that's what they're going to
You're
do
not born with
next.
clothes either, but you have to wear.
That's what they're going to do next.
Well,
It's my inalienable right.
No, but that's a good thing to question, right? Why would there be any law, forcing me to keep myself covered, right?
True. I mean, like, it could just be a cultural thing, right? Maybe we'd get on perfectly fine without clothes.
Speak for yourself.
You'd wear a bear skin if you could.
That's true. I'd probably run around in some kind of animal skin. Okay.
Especially in
Yeah, especially in winter. Well, I wanted to jump into this by first doing a quick round. Let's give ourselves like 5 minutes each, if we will.
Mhm.
And this 5-minute round each is to sort of like in a nutshell, if you can, in 5 minutes, compress your last 2 years. Just sort of like regarding the COVID situation, the last 2 years, how was it for you? How did you experience it, if you can, in the last 5 minutes? If you guys need time, I can start because I've thought
Yeah,
about this, and
sure.
then you guys can get 5 minutes to think about your nutshell. Okay, so in a nutshell, I remember in early March, sort of like late February, early March, we started hearing about this virus doing its thing in China, in Wuhan. There were depictions all over the media of what was happening in China, apparently. The media was showing us pictures of people literally falling, like walking and then all of a sudden falling and then lying there sort of lifeless. And then some hazmat crew would come and do something to them, take them away, and so on. We were seeing images of people lying in the street, and we were told those people basically had this virus. There were images of these massive trucks driving through the streets in the city, blowing some kind of white cloudy material all over the buildings, all just everywhere. It was just everywhere.
Hmm.
And we were told they are like spraying this stuff that sanitizes everything and kills all the bacteria and the germs and the viruses. Okay, and then we had images of people being locked in their homes, locked in their apartment buildings, so far as even welding them shut, welding the doors shut so they couldn't get out. Or I remember one, they were like wrapping a chain around the handles and locking it with a massive padlock. It was just, so things were getting crazy. Then it was like, will it reach Europe? Suddenly Italy has it. People are dying. ICUs are packed out, especially in northern Italy, in the, what was it, the Lombard region? No, what's the northern area there of Italy?
Yeah.
Is it Lombard? Yeah,
Yeah,
Lombardy.
Lombardy.
Yeah. And then we had the incredible footage, incredibly horrible footage of Italian military trucks driving up to the crematoriums and hospitals and picking up the corpses of people who were dying from the virus, because apparently so many people were dying that the crematoriums couldn't, cremate them fast enough. And so these pictures were all over the media. And then it came to Switzerland, and honestly, for the first sort of three months that this was happening, I was fully in line with what the government was saying. I was fully in line with what we were told the science was saying. I was fully in line with what the media was saying. I was fully in line with what we were told the experts were saying. Basically, I had people also in my social circle who were not buying it at that early point. They were kind of critical of it and, this looks sus to me. And I was like, no, this is legit. This is science. You can't mess this. You can't mess with this. There's too many people involved, and so on. Around the third or fourth month is when things started to fall apart for me. I started to see things that I couldn't quite rationalize logically. I couldn't quite follow the science anymore. The science was jumping around too much. The experts were dodging and weaving between various statistical metrics, and it wasn't straightforward anymore, and it wasn't objective anymore for me. And from that time on, I started to actually dig. Around the third or fourth month, and that's when I started to actually dig, first of all, into the PCR test. I started digging into the statistics, how the statistics were being reported, what terminology were they using, and what did that terminology mean. I started looking at bloody, medical papers and journals, stuff I'd never dream that I'd ever have to do in my life. And basically, I went from full compliance with what the government and the media and the task force and the experts and the science and so on, full compliance. Fast forward basically till I guess the beginning, like a year later, and I was going to demonstrations. So, and then basically I was going to demonstrations throughout the entire year of 2021. Very active in the resistance, the Widerstand, and so much changed for me when I look back at the government, the political response, the media response, the academic response, and so on. So much has changed in my view of all of these things. But I started off with full compliance, and I went. I completely made what is that, a 360? No, is that a 360 or 180? 180. I made a complete 180 within about the space of a year. So that's my nutshell.
Two scissors, right?
Go ahead.
All right.
You win.
Yeah, so for me, when I first heard the news, I was initially not scared at all, because I thought, like, okay, this is even if it is something that I mean, we had the Ebola scare. We had different things, and different even wars and
Swine
stuff,
flu
and economic stuff. There was always this kind of like, oh, this if this gets bad, then you're screwed. And this just kind of felt like another one of those things. Like, okay, yeah, they've got this virus in somewhere in China, and they're, maybe it's just the news trying to get a story out of it and make it a big deal. Yeah, and then it turned out like, okay, yeah, this seems like it's a bit more than just a story. It appears to be spreading, but there's a big ass ocean in between us and China, so we're probably good. And then it hopped the ocean, and then I thought, okay, it still doesn't look too bad. It yeah, people are saying stuff, but it will be fine. The whole thing will be fine. And then when it hit Italy, then I thought, oh, okay, yeah, this ain't no joke, and it's gonna be here soon. And at that point, then I switched on to full on like, oh shit mode. So at that point, I was literally at work the guy who was coming in there, literally not trying to touch any surfaces at all, and touching everything with a sanitary cloth. And then when I got into like my like a focus room with just one person in it, just me, I would take like sanitizing liquid and I would spray down the entire table and wipe it all down, and then just work there. And when I was done, I would wipe it all down again and wipe down all like the handles and everything. Like I was really into it. And my main, but even at that point, I thought the actual risk for me was still super low. At that point, like this has always been the thing. The risk for young people has always been low, and that was known. But it was mainly because I'm living with my mom, and she would be in the risk group, that I thought like I'm not going to be the reason for anything happening to her. So that was my main motivation there. And then the time where I started to come around was quite a bit later than Emmanuel. Like I don't even remember exactly when that was. But I was definitely quite resilient with my opinion then, of being, I guess, scared and trying to defend what the government was doing. There was a lot of voices coming in saying that what the government is doing is wrong, and you need to look into more independent stuff. But the issue with the independent stuff was also that it was conflicting with itself. A lot of it. There's just a bunch of noise going on, and the only thing that seemed to be clear was what was coming from the government. Until I started just thinking, okay, I'll give it some more time. I'll give these other voices some more time of day, just to see if there's really anything there. If anything, if I find nothing there, then I can substantiate myself even better than I can now. And when I gave it some more time, then it became clear to me that I also couldn't understand, like I couldn't logic out some things that were happening. Like, some things were just clearly, if not completely wrong, there were some inconsistencies there. So I never went into it as deeply as Emmanuel did. I definitely tried to, and then I thought, okay, I can't be the guy that goes and goes through every rabbit hole. But just after running into some violations of what I think are undeniable principles of what people's liberty should be, and what freedom should be, and what everyone, I think, should agree with to a certain point. Yeah, even if you were to agree with what the government's statistics were and what they told you was correct information, it still wouldn't make sense at that point. And from there, that's when I made the final, I wouldn't necessarily say switch, because it's a spectrum, where you are on that. You're not just for or against, you're kind of, but yeah, that's definitely to the point where I said, okay, what the government's doing is wrong. And then I also ran into the issues of what that means in my personal life, with friends and with people who still advocate what the government is doing. And of course, there was a huge stigma to people who didn't follow along with that, and partly still is. And the other reason that it's calmed down now is because, well, we don't have as many restrictions. It's not really as relevant anymore. And yeah, that was interesting to see how people were, in some cases, abandoning their formerly quite consistent logic, in defense of something which I could only imagine they were doing because of how safe it was. And I also understand, like, as someone who was completely on the side of the government, it's very difficult. It was very difficult for me to come out of that. It took me a long time and a lot of input from people close to me. I know if my own family and friends had not given me input on that, I don't know if I'd even have ever like made the switch to opposing what the government was
Seeing it
doing
differently.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so I can't blame people who still think what the government did is right. But at the same time, that was also very very humbling to experience just how me, who I thought I'm an innocent person, I've not done anything for anyone to be upset at me for, like, ever, and suddenly I was a guy who had an opinion which people could literally like be angry at me for.
Wow. Yeah.
And I didn't do anything. I was
You were
just
a
sitting
heretic.
there. Yeah, I was a heretic.
Yeah.
And I just felt like this is so incredibly unfair. Like, people don't understand actually like, what's going on an individual level.
You just don't care if people die.
Yeah,
obviously.
it was a really bad label being hung around your neck if you just have a certain opinion. And also, as someone who'd never gotten vaccinated with the COVID vaccine, that also made it even more so. It's not just your opinion; you're also going with your actions.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I never did it because I was opposed to the vaccine. I only didn't do it because I thought that especially later when I made the switch, I thought if I got vaccinated, I would be supporting a system that enforces vaccinations. So if I sort of carry a bit of this weight on my shoulders and I say, okay, I'm going to let go of some of these freedoms that I'm used to having in order to not support a system that encroaches on other people's freedoms, that to me seems like a correct trade-off. Something that I was comfortable with doing. To some extent, obviously not being able to go and meet with your friends anymore in restaurants, and it definitely put even more social pressure on. Although I will say thank you to all my friends who actually did still respect that and still made provisions to meet in places that didn't require that. Y'all are the real ones. And of course then that just kind of, it almost in a blink of an eye, it felt like that all just disappeared when they said, okay, we're getting rid of the COVID certificate.
Yeah.
And that was a surreal moment. I almost thought I would be like rejoicing a little bit more. It's funny when at work, when we got the news of that happening, people who I previously thought were like totally in with everything that was going on, they were bouncing up and down.
Right. Right.
There was almost no one who was angry at that.
Right.
I think there were a few, but we'll leave them in their corner. They like it there. That was also really enlightening to see, like, okay, so people were actually, the whole time, they were also feeling in a way oppressed by this. And they were also being just quiet.
They were going along with it.
Yeah.
A lot of them. They were, mass psychosis is a very powerful thing. But Mark, amazing nutshell. That was a wrecker.
That was great. I mean, I guess probably similarities. I would say the main difference is, let's say by the time it made it to Europe, it had already been in China a while, and I already could see from the data kind of that was, they first were saying China wasn't putting out any data, but at some point data started coming out, and I could tell that just didn't really, let's say the numbers even, let's say, not taking them with a grain of salt, even then did not jive with the narrative. And for me, that's, I mean, that's always going to be a cause for concern.
Mm-hmm.
If things, you'd imagine they'd at least have that sorted out, that the things would jive with each other if they really wanted something to be convincing.
Mm-hmm.
So when it got to Italy and you saw that footage, and it's like, the truth is, yes, we're young, but we're not too young to remember all the ones that have already come around in our lifetimes.
Mm-hmm.
Like Vince said, there's been at least a couple different SARS and swine
Mm-hmm.
flu and Asian avian flus and whatever
Mm-hmm.
that we always were told are going to come and kill us, and
Mm-hmm.
Ebola and whatever else. And yeah, so I mean, I'll be honest, out of principle, I'm not afraid of sickness. So
Mm-hmm.
I'm not afraid of sickness. I'm not afraid of dying. So that's going to obviously influence my posturing, my
If you're not afraid of dying,
yeah,
then you.
it's going to drastically
Yeah.
influence my position on this. But I still like to kind of keep informed of what's going on and try, getting a good picture, as good a picture as possible. Obviously,
Mm-hmm.
relying with the information that's being given. Um, so yeah, so very quickly that was clear to me that something was afloat that wasn't, or afoot rather, that just wasn't kosher. I'll put it as clear as that. It wasn't kosher. Something was
Mm-hmm.
not right in Narnia. And I I mean, I actually honestly, I didn't go digging. I didn't feel the need to have to dig anywhere to get any opinions or whatever. I'd look at the numbers that were being put out, being aware that those numbers were going to be questionable. But even being questionable, they were the only numbers I had to work with, but they were so drastically small that there was just nothing to be seen there. I couldn't see anything. Just I'd ignore reading articles, just look at the numbers every day, and like this just, you know that doesn't really work. Obviously, then right away the concern is, okay, well, what's this all about? Why is it being done? Um, do I need to become active? Like, let's just say most human rights have been taken away from people throughout the ages, starting with something like this, out of concern for you. The moment they were deciding what you should be concerned about, the moment people were like down talking elderlies for not being
Mm-hmm.
afraid, for going out and living their lives as normal, I was like, okay, this is not about a sickness. Something is going on here. um I mean, obviously we had the first lockdown. In the lockdown, I mean, here, luckily we were able to go outdoors and that, so life
Mm-hmm.
was not so drastically dampened. I had family members in other countries in the EU, for example, who literally spent a couple of months just in an apartment alone, and I was very concerned for their mental health and their lives, honestly, because of it. Um, at some point, I remembered, because the swine flu in particular, I remember back then there was this big thing, and Switzerland, being that it's such a big center for pharmaceuticals, they obviously have very strong lobbies here. And I remember at that time the government had made the decision to buy millions of vaccinations, and they wanted to shoot them to all the recruits, to kind of,
Mm.
all the military recruits, and then, to kind of inspire the population to get with it. At the end, I believe they shipped them off to Africa, probably as humanitarian aid, that they could, try to make themselves look great about. Um, but I remember that already being a pretty bad smelling scenario. So I kind of dug a little bit into it, because I'm like, oh, it was pretty recent. Let's have a look. And then I discovered, like, the EMEA, I believe that's the European Medical Emergency Agency, something like that. They actually had smelled a rat at that time as well,
Hmm.
and they actually launched an investigation. into possible collaboration between the pharmaceutical companies and the World Health Organization in order to sell a vaccine. That was pretty much, an investigation was for that. They suspected collaboration between the WHO and the pharmaceutical companies to pretty much overemphasize the threat of a certain disease, in this case the swine flu, in order to sell vaccinations. And the investigation actually came to the conclusion that it was indeed so. So for me, that's like, okay, back then it didn't work, and maybe this time they just try it again, you know, and they got everyone on board that they had to, because everyone was definitely on board in this one. There was no one in a position of power, and anyone that was in a position of power, they banned them, they shut down their voice, they shut down channels, they humiliated them, similar to the voices that came out against the Iraq War. There were some famous ones who, well, either were fired from their positions, or I think some even were driven to suicide, if I recall well. So for me, then, yeah, it was obvious. It's like, oh, if there was some opportunity to get out there and raise a voice, I'll raise my voice. So it's like you'd rather err on the side of safety, and if you're seeing safety in this as being safety or protection of as much democracy as possible, then you know, you'd rather go and protest than not protest and then find out that, you know, maybe your worst fears for the situation actually would evolve. And at least then you could say, you know, if someone questions you, it probably is something that came out of the Holocaust or something, but it's like, you know, what did you do when this happened, you know? Well, then I could say, well, I did everything that was within my power. It's like, for me, it was clear. All right, well, if they're going to jail me, whatever, you know. At the end of the day, it's what it is. Get out there. Just the most important thing was to try to do away with this whole narrative they were trying to push, that everyone that was against us was either a nutter or a conspiracy theorist. And I agree completely with Vince. I mean, I'd say the majority of my close friendship circle went completely the way of the narrative, and for me it was like being called, you know, sociopath or murderer was just, you know, you just took that with a grain of salt, because, you know, well, you know, they're being bombarded with this narrative 24/7. It's definitely psychological warfare in this case that was really being waged on people. So I could never hold that. I could never, you know, take it personally or hold it against them. It's like, that was their opinion, you know. They told, oh, if you know, you should go off and live in the boondogs where you can't infect anyone. I'm like, with all due respect, you guys are the ones afraid. Then you can go and live in the boondogs where, you know, then you'll never catch anything from anybody, you know. When I was a kid, I remember Howard Hughes was always spoken about as a real tragedy, you know, of being such a brilliant mind who then, you know, suffered from syphilis and hypochondria or hypochondria in his case. And we pitied the fellow. I remember growing up with a distinct feeling of pity for this great aviator, you know. And then I realized suddenly everyone was him. You know, you go out and everyone was that, and you're like, that this is really suddenly normal now. Like, are we gonna?
Everyone's become completely paranoid of everyone else, right? It's just,
I mean, it was just incredible for me. I wouldn't say everyone, but yes, they definitely pulled a majority, as we saw by the votes, that majority, and everyone tried to mask their fear, their personal fear, as you know, they try to offload it as humanitarianism and empathy to protect others. And it's like, if you're afraid, you can. That's fine. I understand completely if you're afraid. By God, I mean, if I believed anything of what was being broadcasted, I probably would have found some way to be afraid as well. You know, if I had a penchant to fear. But yeah, so that's why, like, when they started easing the measures or whatever, and other people were like, oh, Freedom Day or Happy Days or whatever, I'm like, no, that's just ridiculous. We're just getting back something that no one ever had the right to take away from us.
Yeah,
correct.
Yeah.
So for me, it's not like I break champagne or anything. It's just, it's like, the question was just when, and obviously in retrospect we can say yes, the numbers don't lie. Well, I mean, they possibly do lie, because they've said they obviously had a bunch of messes with the numbers, but I didn't see a single person keel over and die on the floor, which is what I expect from something I would consider an epidemic.
Mm.
You expect to see people literally dropping all around you. And the moment that you are not allowed entry into the supposed places where all these people are piling up, and that was right away, that just smelled to high heavens. And for all those that think I'm just completely anti or whatever, any pandemic or sickness, a very close friend of mine, he actually got caught the COVID, and he had to be intubated. He was, let's say, very close to his death. So it's not that I am one of those that says it's not
It
a
doesn't
virus.
exist.
There's
Right.
plenty of viruses.
Yeah.
I also went to stay with his partner at the time, because she was obviously in a mess with him in the hospital and that, and it never would have crossed my mind that I'd, like, fear would have never taken a hold of me, like, oh, now I'm going to this household where one guy's carted off to hospital, and she's there sick with the COVID. Like, it's just, no, it's like
the hateful rhetoric also went so far as to use the term COVID denier, which is a loaded.
COVIDiot was,
well, COVIDiot, yes, but there was also COVID denier, and this is an extremely loaded term because it is directly coming from Holocaust denier.
yeah,
And this was an incredibly egregious term to be using towards people who are just simply saying, hey, there's a lack of logical consistency.
Yeah.
And so, can we share this?
Yep.
On speaking of Freedom Day, so I had a look at the media to see how they would be portraying this quite historical day, to be honest, and I was pressed to find any headline. I thought, okay, if I'm dealing with an objective, unbiased, media, I would be expecting, those headlines that they have been pummeling us for the last 2 years with big all caps, so many cases, so many deaths, da 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 da. Okay, well, this is what the coronavirus front page for 20 Minuten showed. On some on other platforms like now.ch and Blick, I couldn't even find anything regarding the so-called Freedom Day. And here, yeah, and here you can on Blick, okay, and here you can see it's not even highlighted. The highlight is actually the corona numbers are now only published once a week, and in a tiny little piece there, on top of that, it says "end of the measures." So
it's hilarious.
That is how the media deals with such an important historical day in the whole debacle. This was the poll that was taken on that same article. Do you agree that all measures will be lifted from Friday? Or like this is translated from German, so it's not perfect. But basically, 56% saying yes, it's finally here, and then 29% say they don't have a good feeling about it. 14% are even more skeptical. We'll see, and I do not know. Sounds a lot like we'll see. So I also saw the Nebelspalter putting out what I thought was a very good article written by Stefan Milius. And as a synopsis of this, like it says in the title, it's over and yet nothing is over. And what he's basically talking about in this article is that now we have to start taking a deep breath as a society, and we have to see where we go from here. And we have to see where we go from here, meaning how do we as a society unify again to the extent to which we were unified, let's say, more than 2 years ago. But also, after we've taken this nice big deep breath, inhale, exhale, and so on, let's look at these past 2 years. Let's look at them neutrally, objectively, and as unbiased as we can. Let's look at the numbers. Let's look at what the government did, what the media did, what big players in the economy did, and let's start actually asking the difficult questions. So I thought his take on this was very good and very measured. 20 Minuten also wrote a story yesterday regarding the level of inflation in Switzerland, and they said here that the level of inflation is currently in Switzerland at the highest level it's been in 14 years. And they say the corona pandemic and the war in Ukraine have pushed prices up. And they go on to say that the price of things like petrol and heating oil have surged. Cost of petrol rose by 24.1% compared to the same month last year. So in 1 year, 24% increase on the price of petrol, 54% increase in the price of heating oil in the same period, so in 1 year. Price of pasta increased by 18%, coffee and soft drinks 4.2%. So these things have all been increasing. Okay, if we look at our Euro neighbors, it's been a bit tougher for them. They've had a 7.5% inflation increase, whereas we have had, what was it?
It's it's about 4%.
4%, huh?
Yeah, I think I looked it up because it was minus something a year ago, and now it's gone up to 2.6, the latest figure.
Right.
Hmm.
So that's an interesting, what do you say? Well, an unfortunate consequence of the COVID era.
Yep.
One of the things that, of course, because we are quite short on time this time, so we can't go into things too deeply. But I did have some basic or a few things that I thought might help to set the tone for people who are out there and maybe aren't quite sure of, you know, the question of sort of like what the experts, the science, and the statistics said. And to me, the most important, sort of the clearest thing to me. I mean, you can spend all your life reading medical journals and peer-reviewed papers and all this kind of stuff. That there's this old saying, the numbers don't lie. Well, you know, statistics are not always just numbers, but some people have been going through the numbers over the course of time. And one of the things that I remember coming to the end of 2020, there was a big hype about, because by that time we had seen the government and the media in tow, and the task forces that were set up by the government. We had seen them basically cherry picking which metric they were going to use when.
Yep.
And this is one of the first things that caught my attention when I started to get a bit skeptical of things. That's actually what caused me to get skeptical in the first place, is when I saw them moving the goalposts, that's what I would have termed it to be, from starting off from deaths, and then they went to ICU, because that was kind of like the closest thing to deaths was ICU. And then it went to hospitalizations. And it basically kept moving further and further out. From hospitalizations, it became so-called cases. And then from cases, it became positive test results. And then in between there, I remember quite early on, they also jumped into using the so-called R value, the reproductive value. And I thought it was really interesting when suddenly some expert appeared on the mediascape who said, well, actually the R value is not a legit value to be using in the way it's been used, and therefore we shouldn't be tuning into that. In regards to following the R value and deciding what measures were going to be implemented based on the R value. And suddenly the government dropped it, like, no interest in it. Later on, it suddenly was brought up again. So what I began to see, because the government in Switzerland, for those of you who are watching or listening who were not in Switzerland, the government in Switzerland was giving a press conference every single week to update us on what the condition of things were. And what I was seeing is that every few press conferences, it seemed like all of a sudden they were choosing a different metric. And it seemed to me that the pattern was whichever metric was showing the worst case scenario, that was the metric that they were using. And for some reason, like if deaths were going down but hospitalizations were going up, they'd use the hospitalization numbers. If hospitalizations were going down but cases were going up, they'd use cases. And there was no balance between, okay guys, yeah, the cases are going up, but hospitalizations and deaths are way down here, right? That balance was non-existing. And that's when I began to get really skeptical about the whole situation and how the statistics were being used. At the end of 2020, the whole hype was, all right, we've gone through all these metrics, we've used them whenever we want, or whenever it was pertinent to use them, but the golden metric is excess mortality. That was, I don't know if you remember that. Towards like the end of 2020, it became like the whole thing, wait for it guys, because they didn't have the data, and the data was only going to be released, I believe it was on the 7th of April, 2021. I have that date like emblazoned in my brain. And they were saying, wait till the 7th of April, the Bundesamt, the Federal Office for Statistics, is going to release the data for the year 2020. And then we will see just how bad the pandemic was, and we will put everything to rest. And I was waiting with, like, I guess a lot of people as well, waiting for that day. And that day came, April the 7th, and I was scouring the media, and it was crickets. And I thought, well, that's really weird. Maybe I got the date wrong. And I looked back and I said, no, that's the date it was released. Then I found 2 articles that skimmed on the excess mortality in Switzerland. One said the excess mortality was 7-point-something%, and the other one said it was 11-point-something%. And I thought, okay, that's pretty bad. If excess mortality is 7 to 11%, that's pretty bad. A week later, I was reading in the Med Inside portal, which is a very prominent medical portal in Switzerland, an interview with a very high accredited person in academia in the field of immunology or virology in Switzerland. And he was being asked a whole bunch of questions. And at one point, the person asked in the interview, but isn't it so that the excess mortality for the year 2020 is quite high? And he said, yeah, it is quite high. However, if you control for the aging of the population, and you control for population growth as a whole, actually, excess mortality was worse in the years 2010, 2013, I believe it was, and 2015. I read this and I'm like, what? Like, I couldn't, like, at that point, I was ready to admit that I had just been spending the last 7 months or so, 6 or 7 months, questioning something that should not have been questioned. Right? Because I had seen, okay, the excess mortality was 7 to 11%. But then I read this and I was like, you got to be kidding me. Those 7 to 11% are not controlling for these incredibly vital variables. And that's when I really took the next step at that point. I was like, this is just bullshit. And funnily enough, after that, I began to see more and more statistics coming out, and I'll show you some here quickly so you can see this in graphic form. So this is Switzerland here. So this is the kind of data that was being put out by statisticians who are actually doing the work, who are actually going through the numbers. Like, this is the other thing. The media was giving us all kinds of big numbers, but I was always asking the question in my head, compared to what? Like, you're saying this year this has happened, right? Well, how am I supposed to know if that is a terrible thing? I'd have to compare it with something.
Yeah.
Right? And that's the thing they weren't doing for the most part. They weren't giving me something to compare it with. So here in this graphic, you can see that it's showing a whole bunch of years on the right-hand side from 2010 to 2021. And I'll just go through this real quickly. The most important thing is that on the left side column, I don't know if my mouse cursor is showing up on the screen there, where it says Rang, that is basically sorting the years, so the mortality that is occurring in these years. It's sorting it by you could say best to worst or least to most. So a number 1 is the worst mortality, the worst mortality of those 10, well, actually 11 years. And so this is also broken down here. You can see this is 0 to 19 years of age. The next one is 20 to 59. So you can see here that the year 2020 is ranked number 8 for these 11 years. So nowhere near the worst. For age group 20 to 59, 2020 is ranked number 10. And actually the year 2021 in both age groups is ranked the best. So the lowest mortality. Here is the 60 to 79 age group. 2020 is rated 6th place, and 2021 is rated 8th place. Now, when we get to the 80 plus years of age, that's where we see the pandemic. If you want to find it somewhere, that's the only place that you find it. The year 2020 is ranked number 1, the worst. But the year 2021 is ranked the best, the least amount of mortality. And this has a lot to do with, of course, a virus being particularly nasty, maybe a bit, probably a bit more nasty than previous coronaviruses. But it also has to do with this thing regarding the population aging. And when you study the previous years before the year 2020, you'll see that the mortality has been exceptionally low. So there's this term, I don't remember what it is exactly, but it's sort of like when you're in the forest and there's a bunch of like old stuff that's fallen over, a long period of time onto the ground, and you have like this half a meter or so of like bark and all this stuff, and it's just tinder. It's just sitting there waiting to be burnt up. And that's kind of the thing when you have the population over time aging, and then you have this virus that just comes through, and it's gonna take the weakest members of society out.
Yeah.
But this is the kind of data that was sorely lacking in the media and from the government.
Yeah, definitely.
Another thing that was interesting is when people bring up sort of like, okay, so one of the arguments is that the year 2020 was really bad, but it wasn't so bad because we had the measures, right? So that's the kind of like the catch there. It's like, yeah, but we had Maßnahmen. The problem there is case Sweden. And thank goodness Thank goodness there was one country that was not going to go along with the lockdowns. And that was, in this case, it was Sweden. Later on, it was also the state of Texas in the United States, and what was the other one? California? Or
Florida.
no, Florida, right? Florida, California, and South Dakota. But this is one of the things that I had done previously with people is I put a graph like this in front of them. So this is so-called COVID-19 deaths per million people. So this is adjusted per million people. And I would tell people from this, can you tell me which one is Sweden? Like I've purposefully hidden the names of the countries. And no one can, because if you follow the logic, if the measures, because here's the thing, you had institutions saying that there were going to be 150, 100,000 deaths in the UK or in Germany and so on. And then it turns out that those models were 10 times too high.
Yep.
Right. So the argument there is, yeah, but that's because the Maßnahmen, that's because of the measures. Okay. So, all right, if we follow that logic, then we would assume that a country that is not performing lockdowns and all this, draconian stuff, that they would be having these crazy deaths. They should be having, you should be able to look at them, look at a graph like this, and they should be completely off the chart, right? Relative to the rest of them.
Mm-hmm.
The problem is here. I show you this, and good luck pointing out to me which one of these lines is Sweden, right?
I think it was blue.
You think it was blue? Okay.
I think it was the blue one, right?
Well,
I mean, I was following it as well.
There it is. So they're green.
It's the green one.
The point is, I've done this so many times, and that anyone gets it right is just pure chance. There's no way that you can pinpoint that country out, and you should be, if the narrative is true, you should be able to point Sweden out, right?
Mm-hmm. Well, it should theoretically be on a completely different graph. Like it would be statistically an outlier, but a very important piece of information.
Yeah. So it's regarding statistics and the way the statistics have been reported in the media and by the government. This is where I have been completely baffled that it's not all bad, but it's also emphasis is being put on stuff that is, to put it mildly, highly questionable. I mean, you can go through the whole thing from what actually does a positive PCR test mean, right? Which is another thing which is actually here. This is in German, sorry. But this is a federal what do you call it? Federal court's declaration, for lack of a better term. Entscheid. Decision? Yeah. Decision. And they write here, a positive PCR test is no evidence, is no proof for an infection or an illness. This is what they write here. And yet, what has the media been saying? For 2 years, they've been saying infection and cases. Now, I don't know about the rest of you, but when I hear someone saying there was a case of Ebola,
yeah,
if I tell you there was, 100 cases of Ebola in Nigeria, what comes to your mind? What picture do you see with cases of Ebola?
People near death, hemorrhaging around the eyes.
Yeah.
In hospital, maybe.
Well, if they have hospital.
If they have hospital.
Yeah,
No, but, I mean, clinically diseased, right? I mean, clinically.
I would assume someone
death.
that has the virus. That would be my definition. So even if, I mean, of course with Ebola, the chances of you actually being symptomatic was quite high. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I would expect that they were also having symptoms, but that wouldn't be the precursor for me.
Right.
Yeah. but that doesn't mean that then saying cases should be the most relevant um, statistic there,
Right.
especially with COVID, because most people that are cases are more or less irrelevant. Like they're not going to have a bad time of it.
Yeah.
Even if it's the worst sickness they've ever had, I've never actually had anything I could call as a COVID experience.
Right.
So maybe I've had it, maybe I have. I don't know. I haven't. Uh,
It's just that I have never known the word in medical terms, the word case to equate getting a positive laboratory test alone, which is the minimum standard for these so-called cases, is that at the very least, every single one of these so-called cases has received has gotten back a positive test result for their laboratory test. To me, a case, like medically, was at the very least a clinical diagnosis, and maybe on top of that, you would also have a you'd get a bit of your blood and it gets sent to the laboratory. The doctor gets it back with the result, and he says, "Yeah, like I thought, you have this."
a clinical diagnosis.
A clinical diagnosis. And in this case, what happened was the clinical diagnoses was just completely off the table. It was just completely ignored. It didn't matter at all. And we were just using this term infection, which is another term that is completely, in my view, bogus according to the medical information that I looked at, where an infection in medical terms requires that the pathogen is reproducing. And a PCR test does not say anything, as even this federal court decision states. It does not say anything. It does not prove an infection or even sickness.
Yeah.
And yet the media for 2 years has been running this nonstop to all the people. How like...
Well, the media and the government.
It's fear mongering. It's fear mongering. It's all it was. I mean, at the end of the day, cases. The only thing of interest about cases, let's say, it would be for the authorities responsible, maybe to have an estimate at what point, let's say, herd immunity would be achieved, right? But the way they've been putting out cases, as if that somehow was reflective of how much chance there is of you getting sick or dying, which was what most people assumed would happen, is absolutely ridiculous. It was obviously absolutely needless to print those figures at all.
Right, and that's what we saw just in the last few months, where the hardest measures were brought in with the certificate.
Yep.
And it was all based on the Fallzahlen, the case numbers. And I have it right here. This is the government's own website showing the cases. As you can see here, I can view it in perspective of the entire period. So this is the last few months here. And in comparison to that, if we go to hospitalizations, the hospitalizations look like this. So about a peaking of about half of the peak that occurred in the previous so-called wave. The previous season. And then if we look at deaths, it's even more dramatic, where you have, this is the previous flu season, and this is what has been happening now in the last few months. But instead of the government going, oh, well, look, deaths are so low and hospitalizations are not shooting through the roof, I guess we don't need these measures, right? Instead of that, what metric do they choose? The one with the highest upshoot.
Yeah.
Right? And of course, we had the masks, in almost everywhere being done away with. When was that? On the 15th of February, I think it was. And so this is about here.
Yeah.
That's about there. And after the masks went away, except for on public transport and in healthcare facilities, what did we see? We saw an uptick. We saw an uptick of cases, although we didn't see an uptick in hospitalizations, relatively speaking, nor in deaths. And I saw multiple people on Twitter pointing to this uptick and saying, well, there you go. No masks. There you go. Stupid. Stupid government. And I thought to myself, yeah, give it a little bit longer. And sure enough, look what's happened.
Mm-hmm.
Cases have dropped down. And I've tweeted back at them and I've said, now what? Like, where's your mask theory now? It's gone back down.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, we can spend all kinds of time on this, but the point is, for me, that statistically speaking, this thing has been an absolute nightmare, no matter from which direction you look at it. To me, I found no proof that the measures have actually improved the situation. Again, case Sweden. Good luck answering that one. And then, yeah, excess mortality, all that kind of stuff.
What is interesting is that they already have the next vaccinations probably already been ordered for this year, and they've already ordered a whole slew for next year. So you kind of say, well, if we just look at, you could kind of say, well, this from a viral perspective, we can say is kind of over. So why the need? If it's not about selling vaccines, then why is the need to order 15 million for next year, for example? So I'd say it would maybe throw a little bit of weight, or should at least make people question if there is some kind of similarity to that swine flu fiasco in this effect.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Even if what the government did helped something, saved people's lives. How many? We won't know. What kind of people they were? We don't know if they were near mortality anyway. Point is, if it even did to some extent do what people are, what the general consensus says it was doing, also the side effect, at this point, it's the main effect of what the government was doing. All of the negative things that we are still seeing today, which you outlined there, with economy and with mental health with everything else underneath, was it worth it? And it's not like now, hindsight's 2020. We were seeing right in the middle of it. We're saying, oh, look, there goes a restaurant. There goes this. There goes that. Business is struggling. I think you actually asked personally in a few places.
Yeah.
And of course, with people's mental health, you don't need to be a psychiatrist or psychologist to know. Oh yeah, when you put people in a building, in a society that already doesn't do much for people's mental health anyway, and lock them in there for a few weeks, that's going to go really well. Yeah. And so
I was talking with my sister today, and that's what we came to. Is like, okay, so imagine if you were to say a health of the people in your society is paramount. Let's say ignore the economy, ignore it, like they've been doing. Kind of, oh well, obviously you're going to be willing to give this up and that up and this up and that up to protect whoever, whatever. But then you say, okay, then you're saying health is the priority. But then which department of health are you going to prioritize when you say the statistics now are super clear of the amount, the leaps and bounds in all the mental health issues, depressions. Then you say, so then why did you choose that one health issue over these other health issues? If you're gonna, if you'd get everyone to agree on that health is whatever, you'd be willing to be locked in jail if it's to keep someone else's health supreme. And you say, okay, but what if it starts costing me my health?
Right.
So then you're going beyond the idea of freedom versus safety. You're saying, okay, well then it's your health versus my health. Why should yours be more important than mine?
Exactly. Yeah.
Your lungs, why are your lungs more important to you than my brain to me, for example? or my emotions or my nerves or whatever.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I think people, I'm hoping people maybe challenge the perspective, and I think it's very important that we'd see what can be done, like that article you shared, kind of like, now what are we going to do to make sure this, pretty much to make sure this can never happen
Never happen
again,
again.
or as long as we have the
Yeah.
power to do something about it.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's obviously a very strong political challenge in any case.
Sort of based on that, I think we can start coming to our
Yeah.
closing closing statements. For me, oh, that's you. This quote from Malcolm X. Of course, this was originally based on United States history with racism, but the principle from what he says here, I think, is quite applicable. If you stick a knife 9 inches into my back and pull it out 3 inches, that is not progress. Even if you pull it all the way out, that is not progress. Progress is healing the wound. And of course, the rest isn't applicable. But going just back to business as usual now and saying, like, okay, nothing happened. You know, nothing happened. We can just ignore it. The knife isn't even out all the way. Because we're not back to square one. We're still being impacted by everything that's happened, especially financially. And of course, you know, we don't know what happened to people's mental health, but I don't think it's gotten better in the last time, and those people are still struggling with it.
Yeah. Also,
So-
sorry.
No, yeah, go ahead.
No, also, like you were saying, we're still not out of it, and people's mental health. Part of the mental health is also the people who are still living in absolute, like,
Absolutely.
terror.
Yep.
Yeah.
People,
We're lucky. We're incredibly lucky.
right? I still see, it's very rare, but I still see people. The other day we were in the shopping center close by, and there was a woman, perhaps about my age, mid-30s, mid to late 30s, and she had her two little daughters with her, and she had 2 masks on, and both of her daughters had a mask on. And I just have to, like, I look at that and I'm so sad, like, the fact that this person fears their surroundings so much to the point that they have to do this to themselves and to their children. It, like, their children are not stupid, right? And children will ask, "Mommy, why do we have to wear this and nobody else does?" Right? What is the
Because
what is
mommy
the
loves you.
right? Or, I mean, what's the mother gonna say? I mean, I would imagine the mother has to say something like, well, all those people are just not taking it seriously. I mean, she essentially has to bag out the rest of the society in order to make her position seem legit. And yeah, so people are. I saw someone the other day as well, again with like one of my kids said they had 3 masks on. It was hard to tell, but I just feel really bad for people who are still living under this grip of terror. But of course, if you have some terrible autoimmune disease, and
3 masks isn't the solution.
no, okay,
I'm sorry.
at that point,
There's just no excuse for that.
no. But I think that's part of the mental illness, and to undo that, yeah, that might take a whole generation, maybe more.
Even if we went back to quote unquote square one, like the fact that we still had to go through that, you know, that's still not thing dusted, you know. It's like if someone punches you in the face and you heal, and then you're back to square one. You're not square with them
Until you punch them back.
Well, we're not saying no, 2 wrongs don't make a right, but you know, steal something from them. I don't know.
It's a good quote, though.
Yep.
My closing quote. This is again from John Stuart Mill on Liberty. He says, or he writes, "He who lets the world, or his own portion of it, choose his plan of life for him, has no need of any other faculty than the ape-like one of imitation."
Nice.
That's it.
We'll practice
Lovely.
getting better at that.
Yes.
It's so hard.
Any closing thoughts, Mark?
No, I mean, like you said, this is obviously a topic. I mean, you have to think what's gone on in 2 years cannot likely be lightly discussed in a couple hours.
Absolutely.
But I'll re-stress that. I think people. I mean, I don't think those who were responsible for what was done are ever going to be challenged or taken into account for it.
Mm.
Mainly because the majority of the population was convinced about its righteousness and their own righteousness. In this sense, I do hope people recover. There are a lot of people who will struggle with that, and yeah, I mean, I guess everyone's goal, right, is to try to. I think that's what a lot of people I've witnessed are kind of trying to almost act as if those 2 years just never happened, and let's just pretend it didn't happen. We obviously have been provided a very timely distraction from what might have been the time where people's voices would have been raised against the things that had been done. Um, I think, yes, I'd really recommend people should, like I said earlier, think about what you consider inalienable rights. Go over things like the UN Charter on Human Rights, kind of get informed, realize how many things were actually gone against in these last couple of years by our governments, by all the controlling agencies that control what media we can see, what voices we can hear, what they're doing now with shutting down, news, news channels from certain areas. That all goes against the fundamental human rights charter. So I think people should maybe. It doesn't take a lot of time. There's not that many things considered fundamental human rights. I mean, they've been expanded a bit lately, but go to the basic ones. Read the first 8 or 10 of them. You'll get a pretty decent idea of what has actually been done and why maybe some voices have been challenging. That's
Absolutely.
yeah.
Well, guys, everyone who's been watching and listening to us drawl on, thank you so much. And hope it was worth your while. And if you like this kind of content, please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and pass the word around. And if you guys have feedback, if you're interested in what we're talking about, feel free to join in the conversation, put a comment in. If you want to get on the show, we're always looking for people who want to join us to have all kinds of interesting conversations. If there's a topic that is weighing heavily on your soul, let us know, and we will definitely take it into account for an episode.
Yeah. And if you want to follow our social media, we post clips, and if you want to get updated on when we stream in the future, because we're doing things a little bit differently now with the schedule. So if you want to get informed on that, when we will stream next, then definitely follow our socials. We're pretty much everywhere. Links are in the description. And yeah, that's about it.
Be well, keep well, stay healthy, and
Nice weekend.
for the nice weekend, and stay free.
Stay free.
Do that.
All
Be
right.
free. Stay free.
All right. Have a good night, everyone. Thanks.
Cheers.
Thanks for coming on.
Good night.